Mozart, probably holding the title of history's most famous composer, creating over 200 hours worth of music, and dying aged just 35, being buried in a third-class grave. In this video I will go over his final 6 months of life, death and legacy, and cover some of the many myths and rumours about him. Struggling for money throughout much of his life and racking up some incredible debts, his letters from this period, particularly those to his fellow Freemasons and friends, show him desperately pleading for cash, and during the same time his beloved wife Constanza suffering a series of nearly fatal medical crises. The subsequent years before Mozart's death, from roughly 1788 to 1790, were incredibly hard for money, under immense financial pressure, yet producing some of his greatest and most profound masterpieces during this time. And by his final 6 months of life, things had really begun to turn around. His opera, The Magic Flute, was shown over 100 times in his first year, compared to his masterpiece, The Marriage of Figaro, many years earlier, was only shown 9 times in its initial run. From the July of 1791 to his death, December 5th at 12:55 AM of that year, was an astonishing period of 6 months, was an intensive creative output. In the July, receiving the commission for the Requiem, August, travelling to Prague and writing an opera just in 18 days, then in September, the great premiere of the long-awaited Magic Flute, finishing the clarinet concerto in October, the Masonic cantata, then on his deathbed, December, still working on the Requiem, but with rapidly declining health throughout the 6 months. One common myth is that he never made mistakes and composed perfectly from his head to paper without ever making corrections or rewriting sections. The myth largely came out through his early biographers, predominantly his wife Constanza's second husband, who was Mozart's first biographer, and then the film Amadeus exaggerates his composing style. We know this is completely false, as analysis of his surviving manuscripts show a more human, yet still astonishing process, and entire sections can be seen to be crossed out, with great proof of this being a series of string quartets that he dedicated to his close friend Joseph Haydn, calling them the fruit of long laborious study. These manuscripts are the best evidence against the myth that Mozart never made mistakes. The struggle, unlike his operas where he could write with lightning speed, these quartets took him over 3 years to complete. The original scores are covered in ink blots, scratched out notes, and whole sections rewritten. The piece that sums up his final 6 months of life is his great unfinished masterpiece, the Requiem, the last piece of music he ever composed. Being a mysterious commission by a cloaked messenger demanding a Requiem Mass, music for the dead, under conditions of absolute secrecy, but we know the true patron was Count Franz von Walsegg, who liked commissioning works and then passing them off as his own. Mozart only ever finished 2 sections of it, and the rest was either substantially drafted or just sketched fragments that would later be finished by his assistant or other composers. Because Constanza needed the final payment from the anonymous patron, she had to pass the work off as completed. She asked 2 other composers to help, but they were unable or unwilling to finish the task, so Süssmayr eventually recopied the entire work in his own hand and make the handwriting look consistent before delivering it to the Count. In the years after Mozart's death, rumours began to grow that he had been poisoned, largely fueled by Mozart himself. He told his wife Constanza, "I am only too conscious my end will not be long in coming. For sure someone has poisoned me. I cannot rid my mind of this thought." But was Mozart actually poisoned? The anonymous messenger and the secrecy surrounding the commission of the Requiem deeply disturbed Mozart, leading him to believe the Requiem was meant for his own death. He even named the poison that he believed was being used, aqua toffina. This is a slow-acting, odourless and tasteless poison, containing compounds like arsenic and lead, and known in the 18th century for being difficult to detect. His symptoms, which included a high fever, swelling of the limbs and body, were consistent with major illnesses like kidney failure or acute rheumatic fever, but his feverish and anxious state, he interpreted them as a slow work of a poisoner. And in later years, Antonio Salieri would receive the blame and the accusations that he was the poisoner, the origin of the rumour that Salieri killed Mozart. Shortly after his death, a Berlin newspaper reported rumours of a poisoning, partially fueled by the visible swelling on Mozart's body. After death, due to known professional rivalries and existing German and Italian factionalism in Vienna, the finger was eventually pointed at the powerful Italian court composer Antonio Salieri. The rumour again gained significant traction in the 1820s When suffering from a severe mental decline in hospital and dementia, he had allegedly confessed in a moment of delusion to the poisoning, but later denying this claim, but the damage was done. The idea of poison has been thoroughly dismissed by music historians and medical professionals. Inconsistent symptoms. Mozart's symptoms, fever, rash, swelling, and a relatively prolonged illness, do not align well with the known effects of poisons like arsenic or mercury used at the time. There is also strong evidence, based on death records, from the period that Vienna was experiencing a local pandemic like streptococcal infection, leading to kidney failure. Mozart's symptoms matched those of many others who died at the same time. Many years later, his son Karl recorded how he had become extremely swollen and very irritable, asking for his pet canary to be moved to another room. The death itself. The previous 2 weeks, Mozart had been bedridden and extremely eager to finish the Requiem, gathering a small circle of his friends and musicians around the bed, including his pupil and assistant Franz Süssmayr. They attempted to sing through the completed parts of the Requiem. With Süssmayr sat near the bed, ready to take dictation and complete the orchestral parts, they continued to sing until they reached the Lacrimosa. After the singing had finished, and the musicians left Mozart with Süssmayr to discuss how the Requiem should be finished, this exchange is verified by Süssmayer's later role in completing the work for Mozart's wife. His sister-in-law, Sophie, arrived at the house late in the day, and telling her that he already had the taste of death on his tongue, she left briefly to inform her mother, summon a priest and a physician. Mozart expressed a deep anxiety for his wife and young son's financial state, pleading with Sophie to remain and support Constanza. After the physician had arrived, Dr. Thomas Closet, assessing Mozart's extremely high fever. Following the medical belief at the time, a high fever must be aggressively cooled, ordering clothes soaked in ice-cold water to be applied to Mozart's burning head and body. The result of the application, the cold treatment to a severely weak patient suffering from extreme fever and likely multiple organ failure, is believed to induce a profound shock or coma. Mozart's already low energy plummeted, and then falling into a coma or deep state of semi-consciousness, never fully regaining lucidity. The final accounts of Mozart's last words or sounds was faint sounds of his mouth attempting to imitate the drum passage of the Requiem to indicate rhythmic figures. To Süssmayr, he was still close. By this tragic detail, his obsession with completing the Requiem. Mozart died shortly after midnight at 12:55 a.m. on December 5th, 1791. Mozart's sister-in-law, Sophie, her account describes Constanza throwing herself onto Mozart's body in a fit of inconsolable grief, refusing to be moved until she was convinced he was cold. Shortly after he died, Constanza and Sophie, and possibly a servant, would have washed and prepared the body, according to custom of the time. The body was wrapped in a simple white linen shroud. The body was then placed in the death chamber of a local chapel, with friends and visitors could come to pay their respects. The death had to be legally registered to the local parish priest, who would create the official death certificate, and his death is recorded as severe military fever. Constanza and Mozart's patron and friend, Baron van Swieten, ordered a plain coffin. The body was transferred from his apartment to St. Stephen's Cathedral. The funeral service was held on the late afternoon of December 6. It was a third-class funeral, which was customary for non-aristocratic citizens. It was a brief and simple service. Accounts on who attended differ, but it was certainly a small gathering, possibly only Antonio Salieri, Franz Süssmayr, and a few close friends. Constanza, distraught and following tradition, did not attend the procession or burial. Later, on the 10th of December, the cast of the Magic Flute gathered and performed 2 parts of Mozart's Requiem, the only pieces that had been finished. Between the 5 days after his death to the performance, another composer worked feverishly to add the strings and woodwind parts so it could be sung at his memorial. In the years after his death, Constanza asked many other composers to completely finish the Requiem so that she could collect the fee, but it was finally finished by his student Franz Süssmayr in 1793. Immediately after the service, the body was taken to St. Mark's Cemetery outside the city limits. He was buried in a single grave, not a mass grave or a pit like is commonly believed and depicted in the film Amadeus. Third-class graves also had no tombstone or grave mark in the plot. They were often intended to be used again after another 10 to 20 years to save space, and the exact location of Mozart's body is sadly now lost to history. Around 1801, 10 years after his death, Mozart's specific row in St. Mark's Cemetery was likely cleared. During this process, the bones of the previous occupants were typically gathered and moved into a communal bone area or crushed to save space and reinterred deeper in the earth to assist with decomposition. This is why when Mozart's widow Constanza finally went to visit the grave 17 years after his death in 1808, she couldn't find it. What became of his assistant, Franz Süssmayr? After Mozart's death, he enjoyed a brief but high-profile career, being appointed Kapellmeister of the National Theatre in Vienna, and became a popular composer of Singspiel, German operas, and had a series of hits across Europe that even rivaled the popularity of some of Mozart's own operas at the time. Interestingly, after Mozart, Süssmayr also studied with Antonio Salieri, but much like his mentor, his life was cut quite short. He contracted tuberculosis and his health rapidly declined after 1800. He died just aged 37 in 1803, only 2 years older than Mozart. One thing the film Amadeus depicts is how his fame grew immensely after his death. He was very well known in his lifetime, but nothing compared to Beethoven, when over 30 years later 50,000 people attended his funeral service in Vienna. In Mozart's final year of triumph, 1791, was coming after a massive success of the Magic Flute opera, which premiered 2 months before his death and was a smash hit in opera houses, bringing him great renown, but sadly at the end of his life. In earlier years he had had great success in Prague. Mozart was even more popular there than in Vienna. Especially his operas The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni were adored and performed continuously. When he died, the city held an elaborate public memorial service for him, of which 4,000 to 6,000 people would attend. Where he had racked up such debts during his lifetime, Constanza and the children's financial future looked very bleak, but she came up with the great idea of benefit concerts. Within just a few months of his death, she organised several major benefit concerts, even petitioning Emperor Leopold II, who granted her use of the National Theatre for the benefit concert. It was a massive success and provided her with an immediate safety net of cash. Travelling to Prague, where she enjoyed the most profitable of the concerts, proving herself to be a shrewd businesswoman. After she sold the Requiem to its patron, she also kept a copy of which she eventually sold the publication rights to for a large sum. His fame began growing immensely straight after his death, and by 1799 she sold the bulk of Mozart's original manuscripts for publication. While it wasn't huge, it provided her with a stable baseline of income, combined with her concert earnings and the manuscript sales, moving her from debt-ridden to a wealthy woman. Years later, she married George Nicholas von Nissen, a Danish diplomat and a massive Mozart fan. Together they spent years archiving Mozart letters and writing a massive definitive biography. Although he was quite well known at the time of his death, it was the benefit concerts in the subsequent years that really helped to push his fame, as well as the sale and publication of his scores, making his music more popular and loved than he'd ever dreamt during his lifetime. And even today, 234 years later, on Classic FM, the world's largest classical music radio broadcast, Mozart has the most entries in the Hall of Fame of any composer, with 13 entries.